Right now, your brain is smaller than your great-great-great-great-grandfather's. Not by a little, by about 10%. And nobody can fully explain why. Because the most likely answer is also the strangest thing our species has ever done to itself. It's the kind of fact that should change how you think about being human, and about why being human in this exact century feels the way it does. Walk into the back rooms of any natural history museum and ask to see the Cro-Magnon collection. These were our direct ancestors, anatomically modern humans, the same species as you, with the same DNA, the same eye shape, the same hands. They lived between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago. They painted the walls of Lascaux. They carved bone flutes and buried their dead with red ochre and flowers. They were us, just 1,200 generations earlier. And every single one of them, when their skulls are measured carefully, had a brain about 10% larger than yours. That isn't a guess, it's a measurement, recorded across hundreds of skulls in dozens of laboratories on 4 continents over the last 100 years. The average modern human brain is around 1,350 cubic centimeters. The average Cro-Magnon brain was around 1,500. In some specimens, 1,600. That gap is roughly the volume of a tennis ball. 200 cubic centimeters of brain tissue, about 150 grams of cells, blood, and folded neural matter, gone in less than 30,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that's overnight. Whole organ shrinkage usually takes hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes millions. This took less time than it took us to invent agriculture twice and forget how the first time started. And it isn't regional. Skulls from Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Middle East all show the same trend. Wherever you go on Earth, the brains in the ground are bigger than the brains walking around above them, which means whatever caused this, it caused it everywhere at once. Now look at every animal we ever tamed. Wolves and dogs share a common ancestor about 30,000 years ago. Wolves still have the original brain, dogs don't. A modern dog's brain is, on average, 25 to 30% smaller than a wolf's brain of the same body size. Wild boars and domestic pigs split off about 10,000 years ago. Pig brains are almost 34% smaller than boar brains. Wildcats and house cats, mouflon and sheep. Every single domesticated species we have ever measured, every one, has a smaller brain than its wild ancestor, by 20 to 35%. Smaller, by a lot, not subtly. This is one of the most consistent patterns in all of biology. Tame an animal, and within a few hundred to a few thousand generations, its brain shrinks. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because we have been doing the same thing to ourselves. Compare a wolf skull to a dog skull side by side. The dog has a shorter snout, smaller teeth, a flatter face, larger eyes, floppier ears, more juvenile features that, in the wild ancestor, would have disappeared as the animal matured. Scientists call this neoteny, the retention of childlike traits into adulthood. Now compare a Neanderthal skull to your own. You have a shorter face, smaller teeth, a flatter forehead, larger eye sockets, a more rounded, more juvenile-looking skull. It's the same pattern. Identical, really. In 2014, evolutionary biologists Brian Hare and Richard Wrangham proposed something they called the self-domestication hypothesis. The idea is that for the last 50,000 years, humans have been doing to ourselves what we later did to dogs and pigs and cats and chickens. We selected against aggression. In small bands of hunter-gatherers, the most violent and dominant men got exiled. Over thousands of generations, the calmer, more cooperative, more socially tolerant humans were the ones who had children. There's a real-life test case for this hypothesis already running in the wild. It's called bonobos. Bonobos and chimpanzees share a common ancestor about 1.5 million years ago, but bonobos evolved in an environment with abundant food and no competition from gorillas. With that pressure off, the most aggressive bonobos got pushed out of the gene pool. Modern bonobos are essentially self-domesticated chimpanzees. Smaller faces, smaller teeth, more juvenile features, dramatically more peaceful, and significantly smaller brains than their wild relatives. You are descended almost entirely from the humans who got along well with everybody. And one of the side effects of taming an animal, humans included, is that the brain shrinks along with the rest of the wild. This isn't theoretical. In 1959, a Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev started breeding silver foxes for one trait: tameness toward humans. He took the friendliest cubs in each generation and bred them together. Within 10 generations, his foxes were wagging their tails, licking faces, and seeking out human contact. By generation 40, they had floppy ears, curly tails, multicolored coats, smaller jaws, smaller teeth, and roughly 15% smaller brains. He hadn't selected for any of those things. He had only selected for friendliness. All the rest came along for the ride. But there's another theory on top of that, and it might be even stranger. In 2021, paleoanthropologist Jeremy DeSilva at Dartmouth published a paper called When and Why Did Human Brains Decrease in Volume? DeSilva and his colleagues argued that the bulk of the shrinkage didn't happen over the last 30,000 years. It happened in the last 3,000? Right around the rise of complex civilizations, agriculture, writing, and dense urban living. And to explain it, they didn't compare humans to dogs. They compared humans to ants. In a colony of ants, every individual ant has a smaller brain than a solitary insect of the same body size, because the colony does the thinking. Memory, planning, navigation, defense, those tasks get distributed across the swarm. Any one ant only needs to know its own narrow job. DeSilva's argument is that sometime around 3,000 years ago, humans became something like a hyper-efficient ant colony. We started writing things down. We invented division of labor. We outsourced memory to clay tablets, then to scrolls, then to paper, then to computers. We outsourced calculation to abacuses, then to slide rules, then to calculators, then to phones. We outsourced our spatial sense to maps, our vocabulary to dictionaries, our medical knowledge to specialists, our facts to encyclopedias, our routes to GPS. The brain that used to need to do all those things in one skull all the time got smaller because it no longer needed to. Other scientists push back on all of this. Maybe brains are smaller because bodies are smaller. Modern humans are, on average, slightly less massive than our Cro-Magnon ancestors, and brain size scales with body size in mammals. Maybe brains got more efficient. Smaller doesn't have to mean dumber if the wiring inside is denser, faster, and better connected. Maybe the climate stabilized after the last ice age, and the cognitive demands of survival relaxed. Less variability in food, less variability in weather, less need to remember every plant and every river over a wide territory. Maybe iodine-deficient diets shrank brains in some agricultural populations, and the average dragged down. Probably some combination of all of these, but none of them, on their own, explains the size of the drop. The honest answer is that the world's leading anthropologists, looking at the same skulls and the same data, genuinely cannot agree. And here's where it gets worse. Some studies suggest the trend hasn't stopped. Modern human brains today appear, in a few measurements, to be slightly smaller than human brains 100 years ago. The difference is small. The sample sizes are messy. The error bars are large. But the direction is consistent. Whatever happened over the last 30,000 years may not be a one-time event. It may be the new normal. You may already be a slightly smaller-brained version of your own grandparents. Now, here's the thing. Nobody tells you about a smaller brain. It might not be a tragedy at all. Domesticated dogs are, in raw cognitive terms, less impressive than wolves. They can't survive in the wild on their own. They can't outsmart a deer. They can't navigate 1,000 miles by scent alone. But they can read your face. They can follow your finger when you point. They can interpret your tone of voice. They can grieve. They can love you. Wolves can't do most of those things. And it's not because wolves are dumb. It's because what domestication trades away is raw individual capacity. And what it gives back, in return, is the ability to live with each other. Maybe that's the deal we made too. Smaller brains, bigger civilizations, less savant, more cooperator, less wolf, more us. Think about that for a second. You are walking around with a brain that is measurably smaller than the brains of the humans who painted bison onto cave walls in the dark by torchlight, with hands that knew more about plants and animals than any modern doctor. Smaller than the brains of the humans who first crossed into Australia 50,000 years ago, with no maps and no boats they could lose sight of land in. Smaller than the brains of the people whose stone tools you find in museum cases under glass. And yet you read this sentence in a language they couldn't have imagined. You travel in vehicles they would have called gods. You hold a pocket-sized object that contains the answer to almost any question they could have asked. Your individual brain is smaller. Your collective mind is the largest of any species in the history of this planet. You no longer have to be a genius. You just have to be good enough to participate. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather had more brain, but you have more world.